where we share best practices for investigating, selecting, and building a successful franchise. I'm David Weaver, a franchise investor, franchise consultant, and your host. I interview successful franchisees and franchisors so you can hear from them what it takes and what it's like to successfully start, build, and sell a franchise for yourself. Let's get started. Hey guys, thanks for being on the show. Today for our listeners, we've got Courtney and Steve Reppert. They are successful franchise owners. They opened several locations, built them up and sold them off. And they're here to share their story with us on what it was like to build multiple businesses as a husband and wife team. Thanks for being on the show, Courtney. Why don't you open up and tell us, how did you get into the business? What franchise did you decide to buy? Why did you do a franchise versus starting a business on your own? Kind of tell us your story.
Yeah, so I actually got involved with a franchise called Complete Nutrition. And I think my story of why I got involved is a lot of times why people look into franchising in the first place. I graduated in my undergrad, super high GPA, great LSAT score. I was accepted to Michigan State Law School, got into law school, and I hated it. And I, I spent 5 years, worked for a fancy attorney, all these things, and then realized like I totally got into something that I didn't want to do. And I think a lot of people feel like that and they don't know where to pivot and turn to. And all the while, Steve was actively working with Complete Nutrition. He was actually with them before they even became a franchise. And every time I would go into the business, the energy was just energetic. Everybody was having fun. It was exciting. And I'm walking out of a law school library looking like, looking like I need a nap. And the energy is what gravitated me to franchise ownership. And that's ultimately what made me decide to pivot and kind of scratch that entrepreneurial bug and partner with him in starting to launch franchise locations. So Steve was actually kind of involved in it before I started, and then kind of pulled me into it after I was walking away from law school.
Wow. Okay. So, Steve, you're the catalyst, which typically that can be the case. Walk me through the thought process of being married, getting married, starting a business. Like, how did that all happen? Because I think that timing was kind of, in that same zone. Were you guys married when she was in law school or working for the law firm, or how did that happen?
No, I think we had reached a level of college relationship where we realized gonna get married. I'm saying all this, and I'm hoping I find myself in good standing with my missus as we wrap up this conversation. And some of this is kind of the way I remember it too. But anyway, prior to graduating, so going into senior year, I believe was when I decided that this was what I was going to do. I was going to open a location. We were one of maybe the first maybe 10 franchisees in that system. So it was all really new, but the culture, something we were excited about. And we were both homegrown in Nebraska, which for those who have not had the fortunate ability to spend time here, sometimes there's a lot of America out there to go see. So we're like, let's go do something new. So when we kind of figured out that we were going to build a location, we decided on a place that would work for her law school at the time. And, it's like, well, if we're going to move away together, we should probably make it official too. So we put a bow on it. Best decision ever.
So let me get this straight. You got married and bought a franchise at the same year or the same?
Graduated in May, married in July. Location opened in September. In 3 states over or 4 states over, whatever that is.
Well, and you moved at the same time. So
yeah.
I laughed because my wife and I did something similar. Stack it all on top of the, big decisions like that all on top of one another. The outcome tends to be good, but the process can be overwhelming sometimes. Walk me through your biggest challenge in that first year and maybe some wins and learnings, right? I always feel like you either win or you learn something. You never lose when you own your own business because you're building something for yourself and your family. So walk us through that first year and what that looked like.
I'll take an easy one and then I'll maybe pass it over to Courtney. But I would say the biggest first year challenge is probably not knowing what to do, but being willing to empower people to work for you. You want to build a business, you don't want to buy a job. But if you come in there with full capacity, and I wanted to, right? This was the only thing we were doing. We moved across the country to do it. But boy, you really want some employees. That's why you get into owning a business, is you want people to help you build it. And figuring that out took a little bit of time the first time around, just because you never let people make mistakes, give them grace. So that was probably the biggest thing.
That's a huge one. I tell people all the time, this whole idea that, that in franchise sales, we're selling people the idea that you can run a business and have a general manager run it for you, right? And the biggest challenge with that is having the ability to delegate and being comfortable delegating. And you can do that in a day job when you've got a multi-million-dollar budget, but when it's your own money, man, that just changes something in you, doesn't it? Courtney, you're laughing and nodding your head. Tell me what you think of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess in regards to the first year, you just have to be persistent and committed. You're going to have days where you feel scared. You're going to have days where you face obstacles, but you just have to want it, right? You have to be willing to do really whatever you need to do to be successful. And I think that's where Steve and I were able to really come out of that first year and have really a great first year in business, because we just kind of locked arms and said, we're going to figure this out. And, every day there was really good days and there was hard days, but it's that drive and motivation to want to build a big business and want to achieve. And I think we really knew early on that it was going to be more of a one location deal. We had like a vision for what we wanted to create, but we also were realistic about, okay, well, if we want a second location, what do we have to achieve in the first location to get there? And, we just worked really diligently on that. I definitely agree with what Steve said. If you've never managed people before, something you could do preliminary is read some great leadership books, because your team, especially if you want to scale and add multiple businesses, you've got to know not just how to run a business and manage a P&L, but you have to know how to lead people and motivate people and understand different learning styles and personality types and who does fit in the right seat on the bus and those types of things. And if you've never owned a business before, it can feel a little bit like trial and error. So that's something that in retrospect, I think I actually got into the leadership series. John Maxwell writes a bunch of books and I love his leadership books. I didn't catch on to those until about my second year in business ownership, but I think looking back, had I read some of those books before I even opened my doors, prevented every little leadership hurdle, but it certainly would have laid the foundation for how to lead a team and grow a team in that way.
That's a very good point, Courtney. When as a business owner, I feel like you need to be a lifelong learner, right? All the entrepreneurs that I know are always reading new books. They're always talking about the books that they're reading. Why is that a good book? What did you get out of it? I remember back my first real business experience. I worked in the family business in the foundry. So we made car parts and whatnot. That was pretty challenging. I was only 27, 28 when I stepped into that role. In the process of the chaos, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. So I started reading books. And that was back when Good to Great, Jim Collins, came out. And I read it and I just started doing it because I was in the middle of trying to figure out fixing, building processes, etc. And there's just a couple of things, the flywheel concept that he talked about, the hedgehog concept, right? And you think about what he's talking about and apply it to your business and start doing it. And then it works. And then I saw this flywheel momentum thing that he was talking about in the book actually take hold. I mean, guys, there's nothing more energizing to your comment earlier, Courtney, right? The energy that was coming out of this Complete Nutrition franchise, what is this anyway, right? I mean, you're selling supplements and pills and stuff. And so one thing that a lot of my candidates get stuck on is what the business does, right? It makes pizza, it teaches yoga, it's a fitness class, I can't tell them enough. That's not the point. Right. For me, it's not. As an investor, and there's nothing wrong with it if people really want to get into the business, but it's the energy that comes out of that learning and that aha and the building of the team, Steve, to your point. That's where the energy comes from, and the sheer satisfaction for what you're doing, the payback for the do whatever it takes attitude and that grit that you have to have in the beginning. So really good points, guys. So one of the things I wanted to cover is how do you work as a couple, right? So this whole idea of owning a business is a big idea for a lot of people. And then I'm going to, am I really going to work in the business with my wife or my husband? So Steve, if you could walk me through kind of how you and Courtney sorted all of that out, maybe division of roles is a good way of putting it, or how do you stay in Steve's lane and make sure that you're not stepping into Courtney's lane? Was that a work in progress? Was it very intentional? How would you do it today that might have been different than what you actually did back when you built it.
I don't know what it's like to not work with my wife, to be transparent. I mean, like I said, we came straight out of college. So it's all I know. I can certainly know where there's some challenges. I think division of responsibilities is really important because whether you're employed or you own a business, you're not going to hide from there being challenges with what you do professionally. Something's going to be stressful. You're going to have a flat tire. You're going to have an employee who isn't the right fit, or maybe they move away or something like that. Something unexpected is going to happen, and you're going to have to be able to kind of manage those things. So I think the biggest thing, well, we did a couple of things, honestly. We expanded locations, and we bought locations that were like 60 minutes apart. So by our third year in business, Courtney and I worked in actually different physical locations every day. That was probably easier because then she would go to the location and implement her strengths into the business that day. I would go to a different location and implement in my strengths, and then we would swap in our locations. So that way we weren't kind of stepping on each other's toes. Now, part of that was the size of the business. Like those were like 1,500, 2,000 square feet. So we would literally be stepping on each other's toes when we were both in there. The next thing I would advise anybody to do is, like, if you're a husband and wife team, you've got to respect your personal time. So, I mean, if you're going to go on a date on Friday night, or you're going to go on vacation and you're going to be gone, especially that first vacation, right? Maybe you're 6 months in, you've got a good team, and it's time to go away for a few days. I would tell the team to call me or call Courtney. We don't both need to be stressed out about it. I mean, if we're in Florida and there's a problem happening in Colorado or whatever, like, we can't fix it. We just need to be aware of it. So, I mean, don't let it ruin your personal time.
That's a very good point. That might be, I think you and I had this conversation in Nashville, but my wife and I, when we were in the middle of building our elements business and blending families and trying to get things figured out, like, you do have to take some personal time. So we would have date night. We would schedule date night. We also would schedule weekends off. Like, we're not working, but we're not going anywhere. We're just going to watch football in the fall or whatever, right? Like, intentionally, we're not doing anything, which was actually harder to do than not. But our date night was no kids, no massage therapists, no franchisor talk. Right? Those are the topics that we're not going to be able to talk about. And so then we would get to dinner and be like, so what do you want to talk about? I don't know. Right.
Sure.
So that's a very, very good advice for that. So when you guys were business owners, did you have kids in the picture? Were you in that sort of family building mode? Or, I know you've got beautiful kids now. Is that something that you were doing when you're building the business, or is that after you sold the businesses?
We built a good bit before we had kids. There was a window within there, but we did both. Kids are a lot of work. There's a lot to it. And for anybody this is probably the best advice that I've ever had somebody tell me of a description of starting a business, is maybe you've started a business and you haven't had kids, or maybe you've had kids and you haven't had to start a business. There's a lot of similarities. So you have this new thing that it requires love and care for it to blossom and grow, but you can certainly have a babysitter do an excellent job if you make sure you hire the right ones.
That's a really good way I love that. So one of the things that I've noticed, I've been a franchise consultant for over a decade. Many female candidates that have kids really worry about, if I become a business owner, the business is going to take over my life, et cetera. And therefore I'm going to do a worse job at my most important role, which is being a mom, right? So Courtney, maybe address, what does that look like? Because, like, to your point earlier, you could have been a lawyer and spent all kinds of time being a lawyer and not focused on being a mom. You can be, corporate executive and do the same thing. Help our listeners sort of tie those two things together. How can you be a successful business owner and a great mom at the same time?
I think it's kind of writing down, what does my business need to be successful? What roles or responsibilities do I need to be participating in the businesses? And then also, like, where do I want to be in my personal life to where I'm involved as I want to be? I'm happy. I have, somewhat of balance. I think that the ultimate goal in business ownership is be okay with hiring people, and also be okay with, like, I've always had, to some degree, like a part-time sitter or a nanny. And if anything, that has allowed me as a mom to have balance, right? Where I can work and focus on my work. A lot of women that are entrepreneurial spirited, we're not, like, sometimes always the best with those developmental things. At least that was me. So I would have somebody come in and kind of help with some of that. And that allowed my kids to be able to have fun and play. And then also I was able to work, which is what I wanted to do. So, I mean, it's definitely doable. I think that what I found, I tried cold turkeying the businesses and just trying to be a stay-at-home mom. And I was actually way more overwhelmed and I would say unhappy doing that than having a little bit of balance where I was okay with having somebody come in and help me with the kids so that I could work. It allowed me to do what I enjoy doing, which is working and having a professional career. So I guess my advice would be it's very doable, right? And it's just about finding the right people to help you, I would say both in your business as well as at home. But for me, it didn't work out in my best interest just 100% stay home. I tried it and it just wasn't what Steve can probably attest, but I like tried to force myself like, you will be a stay-at-home mom and you will love it. And I got 6 months in and I was like, I don't love being a stay-at-home mom. So just being okay with hiring people, being okay with getting help. I think that's the biggest thing.
Steve, what would you add to that, if anything?
Be honest with yourself and take control of your schedule. And this is genuinely hard to do when you start a new business. Because like I mentioned, that new baby example, it's hard to take the pediatrician's advice when you have a new baby and they're like, oh, the new baby's fine. 99 degrees isn't a bad temperature. And you're like, well, it's not 98.6. Okay. Tell me why my baby's not perfect right now. If you have a pickup time that you have to have for your kids, and that's a responsibility that you want to keep and maintain, well, then hire and build your business knowing that you need to recruit people who can fill that. And honestly, communicate with those people because they're going to have something that's important to them that if you respect their wishes on, hey, I can't work on Sundays because we have this family activity and that's really important to me. So please don't schedule me on Sundays. When you have that type of communication with your team, it'll never go to 0% conflict, but your conflicts are pretty minimal.
That's a very good point. So really learn to hire and build a team around personal life or business life and set those expectations. I love what you said about controlling your schedule, like own it, right?
You'll have to do a pep talk in the mirror once in a while.
There's an author that talks about something about high-fiving yourself. My wife was listening to, but yeah, I think that's what you made me think of. One of the things I like to share with my candidates is our story. So we owned our Elements when the kids were like grade school through middle school. And then we sold right before they got into high, like maybe their freshman year or something like that. And that was intentional because we wanted to be around during the high school years and that kind of thing and be more present and especially necessary for my son there. One of the stories that I love to tell is you never know what the kids are going to learn, right? So as middle school or grade school and middle school kids, two stories stood out. So one thing that my wife felt really bad about, one of the locations was right next to the middle school. And so she would just have our daughter walk from middle school to the store and then sit back in the break room and do her homework, right? For a couple hours. And she always kind of felt bad about it, but it was like just logistically that's what made the most sense and whatnot. But the outcome of that is massage therapists are really proud of the knowledge that they have about the muscle structure and how all that works, right? And they kind of think of themselves in a medical way. Well, our daughter would come back there and sit with these massage therapists and ask all kinds of questions about the body. And now she was in med school, right? So like, didn't see that coming. And then my favorite story is my other kids, we're going to do a lemonade stand, right? They might've been 10. So they do the lemonade stand and I kind of gave them a little bit of structure. You got to have flyers, you got to have marketing, right? You got to have operations. So what kind of lemonade are you going to have? And just kind of give them a little bit like that. So 3 or 4 hours go by and come in and sit down. I was like, hey, how'd the lemonade stand go? Well, I had to fire Andrew. Andrew was the little kid down the street. It's like, you had to fire him, huh? I was like, it's a lemonade stand. So why'd you fire him? Well, he kept drinking all of our inventory. Yeah. Like, can't have that. So it was, Andy wasn't listening. He wasn't listening and he was drinking all the inventory. And I thought, for about a 10-year-old or 12-year-old, like the language that they're picking up on, right? Just because of being around us. So
Andrew's responsible for too much inventory shrink.
That's right. I mean, it's going to hit the profit margin, whatever. So I always think, you know what, you never know where that's going to go. The lessons that you're teaching the kids that you don't even know that you're teaching them can be pretty phenomenal. So thank you for sharing all that. I think that's super helpful and just sort of understanding what does it really look like to be a business owner with all of these different things pulling at you. And at the end of the day, just go do it is really what I'm hearing. So Share us the pivot. So you guys built these stores and now you both work for the same company and both in franchise development or franchise sales for different brands under the Horsepower umbrella. Share with our audience, what does that mean to represent different brands under one umbrella? What is Horsepower Brands? What makes them different and why you guys decided to get into this role rather than selling your businesses and starting another one or going for 3 locations to 20 locations. Like a lot of people don't understand that. I don't really have a good answer. I'm like, I get bored. And so I like building things and selling them off, but a lot of people don't even that doesn't register with them. So what's your story kind of pivoting from business ownership to Horsepower Brands today?
We had at that point 3 little kids. We were approached by a buyer and just kind of knew 3 little kids approached by a buyer. Everything was kind of lining up. We'd been talking about possibly selling our locations for a couple of years, but it's kind of one of those things when all of a sudden things start happening and you don't necessarily, that wasn't 100% your plan, but the stars start aligning. And Zach Butler had reached out to Steve. At that point, we'd still lived in Virginia because that's where our locations were. And we'd been talking about selling the locations for a couple of years. Zach had reached out 6 months prior, and we were still at that point pretty focused on just running our locations. Then over the course of that 6 months, again, had somebody approach us, started those conversations. It all kind of happened at one time. Of course, just like how we got married and launched a bunch of businesses, we also were kind of selling our locations and then decided to go ahead and move back to Omaha. That's where they wanted the Horsepower Brands headquarters to be. Something that Zach's really passionate about is having everyone kind of working as a team, collaboration, those types of things. And so truly it all kind of happened right at once. We were selling the locations and pivoting, moving back to Omaha. We sold our house. We bought a house in Omaha. Steve actually worked for Horsepower for about a year, and I decided to stay home with the kiddos. I was kind of the buffer in between the sale and the transaction, and of course, him taking on a new role at Horsepower. So I was still actually working remotely for our locations until they were completely sold. And then after about a year, I was kind of looking at, okay, what do I want to do? I just sold our locations and ended up pivoting and reached out to some people in franchising. Of course, you have relationships there and started having conversations and understanding the different roles and ended up deciding to partner with Horsepower and do franchise development. I think in franchise development, it's such an easy conversation because when you've owned a business and you've scaled a business and you've managed teams and you've done marketing spend and you've done local store marketing and all these things, it's just so easy to have a conversation. There's so many days that people ask me questions that to them, they're like, I have no idea how to do this. How do you get to this point? Or what do you do about this? And because you've lived that life for so many years, I think both because we not only were franchisees, but we were multi-unit franchisees in multiple states, you already see the pivot. You know how you pivoted, you know how you handled it. And I think that candidates appreciate that. Horsepower is a home service portfolio. So their focus is on home services. They want to be kind of the biggest and best in the home service space. For me specifically, I won't speak on behalf of Steve, but we own high-end brick and mortar fitness boutique locations, which is the total opposite of home services. We were in 5 to 7 year leases. Our rent was $5,000 a month. We had a lot of W-2 employees. We had brick and mortar build out for all of our stores. Every single, just like you, David, you're always like, what's the next business that I should buy? Or what's the next thing that I should do? I am very guilty of that. I think until I retire, I will always have my eyes open and looking at, I wonder what this is. And, how did they do this? And is that something I want to do? And so Steve and I both sat on the leadership council with Complete Nutrition. We were on the product development team. We actually helped to develop the supplements that were created by Complete Nutrition. So we were super fortunate that in the nutrition and fitness boutique space, I feel like there wasn't anything that we really hadn't done. We were top performing franchisees, worked with the CEO and the founder, product development. And so for me, I think it's been really awesome to learn about home services in this new space that is becoming wildly popular in franchising. It's awesome to work with a privately held but very well capitalized franchisor. Everybody that knows Josh Skolnick knows he's a great leader and he's a patient leader, and he gives a lot of grace and extends a lot of flexibility, I feel like, to our team to let us grow into our role. Just like what you said, I'm always eager to learn or do something new. And this has been that new thing that I've been able to do. And it's been a lot of fun.
That's fantastic. Well, you guys are growing like crazy, which is a lot of fun. Steve, could you speak to, you've been a franchisee, you're in franchise development, so you see a lot of candidates, right? You're talking to a lot of people that either buy a franchise or don't. One of the things in my consulting practice that I emphasize with my candidates is when you're dealing with an A player franchise brand, right, and or a franchise brand that's growing really fast, when you have somebody like Courtney selling it, they're pretty selective, right? And so I want to prep them because not all franchisors say yes to the candidate that wants to buy. What are the things that you look for, you personally as a business development person or horsepower as a company, in characteristics of that candidate that makes that candidate at, oh yes, we're definitely bringing this person on, or big question marks that need to be answered before we bring them along or we've turned them down, right? So a lot of candidates wonder, do I have what it takes to be a franchisee? I'm just saying the same thing a little bit more granular. What is it that you guys look for that makes a candidate a standout or a candidate a big red flag?
I think the most important thing they can do is be an active participant in learning and understanding the brand, whether that's taking the opportunity, in our process, they have the opportunity to talk to the leadership team multiple times well before they ever make the decision on, if this is right for them or if it's right for us. I think the important thing for anybody to know is it's certainly you that are exploring the business, like you're trying to find the right opportunity, but the franchisor, like in this process, you kind of date me, but you marry into the system. We really want to make sure that that's a good business marriage. Are you a good fit? High performing franchise location is certainly what they want every single one of them to be. So the better we can do about making sure that people have a good awareness of, what you're getting into. I always kind of like to use the terminology that I've came up with in Best is you pay for an investment, but you build a business. So are you prepared to build this business? Now that can look differently. If Courtney and I both started two separate businesses today, one of us might decide to take everything by the reins. The other might decide, I'm just going to focus on empowering people. Both of those are perfectly successful ways to do things. It's just, do you have the right expectations of yourself and of what does the franchise provide? So I think it's just kind of matching those two things up. Those characteristics can look wildly different if you're in a franchise that has the right amount of supports. Sometimes a sales background is great. Sometimes it's not necessary. If you're great at sales, you're probably going to need to hire somebody who's great at operations. If you're great at operations, you're probably going to need to hire somebody who's great at sales. And the number one thing I always like to tell people is if you're not good at sales, don't try to be the salesperson. Hire them. They're much better at it.
Yes, that's so true. The other thing that I always like to emphasize is, so in franchising, for the listeners that don't understand, item 7 of a franchise disclosure document tells you how much does it cost to get this business started. Item 19 tells you how much money most franchisees are making and gives some representations there for most franchise brands. Steve, what you hit on is very important. The item 7 with most franchise brands, we'll use Bumblebee Blinds compared to other blinds franchises, right? Your item 7 is actually more expensive because you're baking in the cost of that general manager, because we're assuming that you're not going to be an owner operator, right? Now, if you're comparing that with another brand and the assumption is the least expensive thing, then you are the operator, you are the salesperson, you are the person, the GM. But if you're going to buy into a franchise, you need to be adding capital expenditures for that person, that salesperson or the GM or the ops person. One thing that I really want to emphasize is get that right first before you make the buying decision, because you need to make adjustments as the candidate, right? And that's tricky for a lot of owners. Maybe share your experience with that when you're working candidates through the process to make sure that they fully understand where they need to be for their loan or their investment range, because it can be quite different than what's actually in item 7, right? Or am I overemphasizing this point because I want to make sure my candidates are really careful?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, you're buying into a franchise system. They have a playbook. They have an operating process. Obviously, if you're joining that system, it's because you want to implement those processes. But there is an element that you're going to have to make it your own. There's going to be unique things that happen in your area. There's going to be the staffing that applies to your particular business. You want to make those types of adjustments as you're exploring things. You'll have great conversations as you go through and you learn more about a franchise concept, and you might get a lot of great information from an owner operator. That's true for their location, but you want to make it true for you if you're planning on hiring a GM and not running it that way. And so you're going to have to make that adjustment of that employee cost and kind of make the assumptions that follow appropriately.
Well, guys, this has been fantastic. Really, really great information. Courtney, I'll let you close things out. If you were to give any franchise candidate or somebody that's contemplating business ownership for the very first time, let's assume they're, leadership in corporate America, they're a seasoned corporate executive, and it's just, they're ready for a pivot, to use your words earlier. What piece of advice would you give that candidate in evaluating business ownership?
Going through the discovery process, keeping an open mind, I think is incredibly important. I know that some people start those calls and cadences and they want to make assumptions, but using my example of being in the fitness space and then switching over to home services, I can tell you it would be so easy for me to make assumptions on home service franchises and things like that. But I've come into my role with an open mind, learning. I remember in the first month that I worked at Horsepower, I was scheduling every single possible meeting with any possible person within the company because I was eager to learn. And I think that's the attitude that you have to have, is you need to have an eagerness to really learn. I mean, these people are typically going to be experts in the industry. And the reason why they're doing things a certain way is likely because of past experience or trial and error. And so keeping that open mind to want to learn, why are they doing it this way? Being eager. I would encourage you to be on as many discovery day calls as possible. Try not to do a ton of rescheduling, because in hot markets, territories typically do move quickly. And so if you have a reschedule, that developer a lot of times is busy. It can be hard to get back on their calendar. So make it a priority. If you really want to make a change in your career, make it a priority. And then every franchise brand will allow you to attend what's called validation. And these are kind of open forum conversations where you get to talk to franchisees, brand presidents, people that are going to be supporting you as a franchisee. And it allows you to meet these people, get an understanding of the culture, how they're being successful. And I would encourage you to get on as many of those as possible. I feel through the discovery process, it really does. You should really get a high aptitude of what this company is doing. And those calls are going to allow you to do that.
Fantastic. Really good advice, guys. Thank you so much for being on our show. FranchiseYourFreedom.com is the website. Courtney and Steve, really, really great insights to husband and wife team building successful businesses. So thanks for your time.
Yeah, awesome. Glad to join.
Thanks for having us, David.
Sure. Where we focus on ideas that can lead to your impact on your community and your family by creating your freedom through franchise ownership. If you found value in what we discussed today, please hit the subscribe button or follow us on your favorite platform.